The ashes clung to Myra's skirt like soot to old stone. No matter how many times she brushed them away, they always returned. They came from the kitchen fire she stoked before dawn, from the hearths she cleaned before others stirred, from the bread ovens and the incense burners and the oil lamps she was never allowed to light for herself. The house smelled of jasmine and melted fat and sometimes of lavender soap, but Mira always smelled of ash. That was how her stepmother liked it. Ash made Mira invisible. Ash made her forgettable. But Mira did not forget. Her father had once lifted her in arms that smelled of cedar wood and whispered that she would be stronger than the sky. That was before his accident on the mountain road, before the strange carriage arrived with the woman in velvet gloves and a girl whose teeth were too sharp when she smiled. That was before her father's bed was stripped of his scent and his portrait replaced with a mirror framed in gold leaf. And it was long before Mira was sent to sleep in the cellar beneath the pantry, where potatoes grew eyes in the dark and spiders claimed the corners like tiny landlords. The woman, now her stepmother, had a name no one ever used. She was simply Madame. Mira had tried to call her mother once in a moment of naive desperation, but was slapped so hard that her ear rang for 2 days. After that, Mira said nothing unless spoken to. And even then she measured her words like a merchant counting coins. Every morning began with the same ritual. Mira woke before sunrise, crept out of the cellar on silent feet and began her tasks. She fetched water from the well, chopped kindling for the stove, boiled grains for breakfast, and scrubbed the tiled floors until the grime surrendered. She polished silverware she would never use. She ironed silks she would never wear. And when the sun spilled gold through the windows and the upstairs bell rang once, just once, she dropped everything and went to Alenia's room. Alenia's door was always slightly ajar, as if even the wood dared not displease her. The room inside smelled of perfume and powdered rose petals, heavy enough to choke. Mira would kneel by the cushioned settee where Alenia reclined like a queen, her long legs stretched out, toes pointed in idle contempt. Alenia never looked directly at Mira during this part of the day. She always gazed into her mirror instead, admiring her own reflection as Mira removed the slippers from her feet and began the washing. The water was lukewarm, the bowl porcelain. Myra's hands, red and cracked from work, dipped the cloth and began with the left foot. Alenia would hum. Sometimes she would talk, mostly to herself, sometimes to her mother, who lounged nearby in her dressing gown, sipping citrus wine, and occasionally to Mira, if she needed something to mock. "Careful, your hands are rough," Alenia would say, curling her lip. "You'll scrape my skin like sandpaper." Mira said nothing. She simply adjusted her pressure and continued. "You're lucky, you know," Alenia mused one morning, swirling a strand of hair around her finger. "Most girls like you would be out on the street. But Mother is generous. She keeps you fed. She lets you sleep indoors. She even lets you wash me. That's honor, really. Don't you think?" The words dug in like glass, but Mira nodded. Because silence was safer than pride. Silence kept her alive. Sometimes Alenia stretched her toes in Myra's face, daring her to flinch. Sometimes she kicked the water bowl just to spill it and demanded it be refilled. Sometimes she whispered stories about how Myra's father had wanted her to marry a stable boy, how he hadn't really left Mira anything, how maybe he hadn't loved her all that much. Mira never reacted. Not with words. But her hands always trembled, just slightly, when they reached for the towel. Every night after the house grew quiet and her chores were done, Mira returned to the cellar. She had a small mirror of her own, cracked at the corner. She would light a stub of candle and stare into it, not at her face which she barely recognized anymore but at her eyes. The only part of her she still trusted. They were her father's eyes. Gray like storm water. Watchful. Patient. She stared at them until the candle died. The other servants whispered about Mira when they thought she couldn't hear. They pitied her, but no one dared help her. Madame controlled everything. She controlled their wages, their sleep schedules, their futures. Defiance wasn't bravery, it was suicide. But Mira knew things. She saw the way Madame unlocked the drawer in her study with a key worn on a velvet ribbon. She knew that Alenia's bed frame creaked a certain way when she hid letters beneath it. She knew the cook sometimes diluted the wine to steal the rest. Mira never spoke of these things. But she stored them like embers waiting for dry straw. And she knew Alenia's secrets too. Alenia was flawless from a distance, tall, golden-haired, lips always red as fresh berries, but Mira saw what others missed. She saw the way Alenia flinched when touched on her left side. She noticed how her posture always leaned just enough to hide her left foot. She knew how carefully the bathwater was scented, and how the slipper for the left foot was always slightly stiffer than the right. And most of all, she knew that one toe, just one, never moved when Mira washed it. The first time she'd noticed, she thought it was a trick of the light. But then day after day it remained still. The others flexed, curled, shifted. But the last toe on Alenia's left foot remained frozen. Mira had once brushed her finger along it gently, and the surface was wrong, too smooth, too perfect, like porcelain or wax. She'd looked up then for just a heartbeat too long and caught Alenia watching her. The air turned cold. Then the slap came. "Don't stare," Alenia hissed, "or I'll have Mother blind you." That night Mira didn't cry. She lay awake in the dark, pressing her fingertips to her cheek, remembering the feel of that toe. She didn't understand what it meant yet, but she knew it did mean something. Something important. So she waited. And watched. Every basin of water, every discarded slipper, every flinch or flicker in Alenia's expression, Mira studied it all. Like a scholar with no parchment, like a spy with no army, like a daughter her father would still be proud of. She had no allies, no power, and no voice anyone respected. But she had her silence. She had her memory. And one day Mira knew even a single toe could bring the whole house down. The sun had dipped low, casting honey-colored light through the manor windows, gilding the tapestries and turning every speck of dust into floating gold. It was the hour Mira dreaded most. The hour of washing. Her knees found the rug in Alenia's room before her mind had even caught up. Years of repetition had trained her body to move without prompting. The silver basin was already filled with warm rose-scented water, its rippling surface shivering under the weight of expectation. Beside it, a folded towel lay like a symbol of surrender. Alenia reclined on her chaise, humming to herself as she toyed with a string of pearls wrapped twice around her wrist. Her golden hair tumbled in lazy curls over one shoulder. She looked every inch the noble daughter, every inch the heiress of comfort and command. Myra's reflection shimmered faintly in the mirror behind her, a shadow kneeling by the feet of a queen. "Slower," Alenia sighed as Mira dipped the cloth into the water and began to run it over her right foot. "It's a foot, not a floor. Pretend it's made of glass, little mouse." "Yes, miss," Mira whispered. The ritual had become muscle memory. Wet cloth. Gentle strokes. Avoid splashing. Rinse. Dry. Repeat. Mira never allowed her hands to linger too long. She kept her head bowed. She never looked up. But today something felt off. When she reached Alenia's left foot, her fingers slowed. The toes curled slightly, elegant and pale, like pearls half buried in sand. All except the last one. The smallest toe. It remained perfectly still. It wasn't rigid exactly. It didn't appear broken. But there was something too still about it. Not the natural stillness of a toe at rest, but the unnatural stillness of something pretending to be part of the whole. Mira blinked. She brushed over it again very gently, the cloth cool and wet between her fingers. The toe didn't move. Not a twitch. Not a reflexive curl. The other toes flexed slightly, responding to her touch, even arching faintly at the top of the foot. But the last toe? It was like it wasn't alive. She felt her breath catch in her throat. It was smooth, unnaturally so. No ridges of skin. No callus or nail edge. Just a soft, waxy surface. Mira ran the cloth over it again, slower this time. And then she realized there was no heat coming off that toe. The rest of Alenia's skin radiated faint warmth from the hot bath she'd taken. But that toe was cooler. Not cold. Just not warm. Her fingers froze. In that moment Myra's gaze lifted, just for a second. Her eyes, unbidden, darted upward. Alenia was staring at her. Not in the mirror. Not through her lashes. Directly. Her eyes were sharp, her face still, but a tightness had crept into the corners of her mouth, into the angles of her cheekbones. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was alertness. Awareness. Mira looked down immediately, panic flaring in her chest. The silence that followed felt like the pause before a storm breaks. Then came the slap. It landed so hard Myra's head jerked sideways. The taste of copper filled her mouth. Her eyes stung, but she didn't cry out. She pressed one hand to her cheek, breath shallow. "Don't stare at me like that," Alenia hissed. Her voice had gone low and sharp, like a knife slicing silk. "Who gave you permission to look?" I didn't mean," Mira began, but Alenia stood. "Didn't mean to? Oh, I think you did. You think just because you're allowed to touch me you get to study me? You think you can just look whenever you please?" Mira shook her head quickly, eyes cast downward. "No, miss. I'm sorry. You forget your place." Alenia's voice now had the cruel amusement Mira dreaded most. She felt Alenia step closer, the fabric of her gown brushing Myra's shoulder as she loomed over her. "You're not a girl," Alenia whispered. "You're a hand." That's all. A pair of hands to scrub the grime off my feet. Don't confuse that for a right to curiosity. Mira swallowed her words and nodded. Finish the wash. Then go back to your hole. Myra's fingers trembled as she picked the cloth back up. The basin water was still warm, but the heat had drained from the room. When the washing was done, Mira dried Alenia's feet with the soft towel and slipped her slippers on, careful not to glance again at that last toe. She retreated quickly, head bowed, back aching, cheek burning. In the cellar, she sat in the dark beside the potato sacks and let herself shake. It wasn't just the slap. It was the certainty of what she'd felt. That toe had not been real. It wasn't just numb or injured. It didn't belong to her. And for a moment, Mira wondered if it had ever been part of Alenia at all. A fake toe. What? That night Mira couldn't sleep. She lay awake long after the moon had risen, listening to the soft scurry of mice behind the wall and the slow drip from the ceiling near the drain. Her mind kept returning to the toe. Why fake just one toe? Why go through so much effort to hide it? If it were merely injury or illness, why not explain it away with some tragic tale of childhood misfortune? It was not like Alenia ever shied away from being the center of attention. But no, this had been hidden. With intention. With skill. And it wasn't just the toe. There had been other signs. Mira began to string them together like beads on a necklace. The way Alenia always avoided going barefoot around strangers. The way she insisted on expensive oils and perfumed socks. The way her slippers were custom-fitted and always replaced twice as often as needed. Mira began to recall, with eerie clarity, the moment she had seen her stepsister hunched over a desk once, years ago, carefully sculpting something with a heated spoon and a tiny metal tool. She had thought Alenia was simply playing with wax seals or trinkets. But now, could that have been a toe? The thought was grotesque. Impossible. And yet, Mira pressed her fingers to her cheek, where the sting of the slap still pulsed. That pain had meaning. It was more than punishment. It had been a warning. A defense. A message loud and clear. Do not ask. Do not wonder. But Mira couldn't stop wondering now. The next morning when she came to Alenia's room, she was even more careful. She didn't let her eyes drift. Her hands moved efficiently, avoiding contact with the strange toe. She said nothing, not even good morning. Alenia didn't speak to her either, but her posture was tense. She watched Myra's every move, sipping from her teacup as if daring her to make a mistake. When the ritual ended and Mira was dismissed, she nearly bolted from the room. Days passed. Mira observed in silence. She began to notice other details. The way Alenia walked with a slight hesitation on her left side. The way her balance shifted on staircases. The way she avoided dancing barefoot on festival days, claiming delicate arches or cold floors. It had always been there, hiding in plain sight. But no one saw it. No one wanted to see it. And now Mira began to remember something else. A memory so old it had faded to dust in the corners of her mind, only now stirred by curiosity. She remembered being very young, barely older than 5. She remembered standing beside her father in a room with red curtains and a physician murmuring something about a birthmark. A strange birthmark. On her own foot. A shape like a crescent moon, silver pale against her skin. She remembered her father saying, "She's the one then." And the physician nodding. Then, nothing. A sharp pain. Bandages. And after that, silence. She had forgotten it until now. She pulled off her slipper that night in the cellar and looked at her own left foot under the flicker of a stolen candle stub. The skin was smooth now, but there was a faint ridge. A thin line. As though something had once been removed. Something important. She curled her toes. All of them moved. The smallest one moved just fine. And then it struck her. What if the toe had been taken from her? Not lost. Not injured. Stolen. The idea was madness. It was horror. And yet, in her bones she felt it might be true. Because Madame had never loved her. And Alenia had always worn the inheritance like a borrowed coat. She didn't know yet what it meant. But she knew this. Something had been hidden. Something tied to that unmoving toe. And whatever it was, it had been stolen from her, body and name and all. Mira began to wait, not with dread but with purpose. She washed feet in silence. She did her chores. She obeyed. But now, beneath every motion she was watching. Waiting. Because the smallest toe, the one that never moved, had begun to whisper louder than all the voices that had ever tried to silence her. And it would not stop. The bell rang out at midday, long and deep, not the brittle clang of market hours or the sharp strike that marked the baker's bread rise. This was the king's bell. It told only when something of weight, something of fate, was set into motion. Mira was in the orchard, gathering fallen fruit for the stew, when the sound rolled across the hills and settled in her bones. She paused, an apple in her hand, brow furrowed. All around her, workers lifted their heads, pigeons took wing, and the manor's windows opened as if to catch the news carried on the air. By the time she returned to the kitchen, the house was buzzing. The steward had arrived with a parchment scroll bearing the royal seal, and the cook, too distracted to scold Mira for her dirt-smudged sleeves, waved her off toward the main hall where the mistress of the house stood at attention. Madame held the scroll as if it were forged of pure fire. Her lips were pinched so tightly they had blanched white. Alenia stood beside her, cheeks flushed, eyes gleaming with something close to triumph. "It's true then," Alenia said softly, almost reverently. "The prophecy." Mira stopped just short of the stair, silent as a held breath. Madame read aloud, her voice clipped and precise. "By decree of His Majesty King Theros of the Eastern Realm, and by wisdom of the High Oracle of Vale, a summons is issued to all maiden women born under the waning of the 13th moon. A sign, known as the Mark of the Silver Moon, will appear on the foot of the one foretold. She shall be brought before the royal court. She alone shall wed the crown prince and restore balance to the land." The room was still, as if the walls themselves had inhaled. "The mark," Madame said, more to herself than anyone else. "It had to be the foot." Alenia exhaled, her fingers dancing over her skirts. "I always knew I was destined for more than this." Myra's mind was spinning. A mark on the foot. A prophecy. A marriage that would change the kingdom. She'd heard whispers of the silver moon myth, of course, every child had. A maiden born with a mark like a crescent moon, chosen to heal the wounds of a kingdom fractured by years of war and famine. But those stories had been told in the dark by fireside, in voices barely above a whisper. Not like this. Not with banners being raised and messengers dispatched. And she remembered something else too. Not a story. A memory. A faint, silvery shape on her own foot long ago. A birthmark like a crescent. Her father's voice, "She's the one then." The words rang again now, louder than the bell. She looked down at her foot, encased in old leather, the laces frayed. She couldn't see the skin beneath, but she remembered. And more than that, she remembered the scar where the mark had been, where something had been cut from her. Suddenly the slap from Alenia made more sense. The fake toe. The strange balance. The effort to hide that foot from everyone, even from mirrors. Could it be? Could Alenia be pretending? Madame turned abruptly, snapping Mira from her thoughts. "You," she said sharply, eyes locking on Mira as if only now remembering she was present. "You'll help Alenia prepare. Bathe her. Polish her slippers. Her foot must be perfect." Mira kept her eyes down. "Yes, madame." Madame's voice turned steely. "She is to be presented before the royal court within the week. No mistakes." Alenia turned with a flourish, already preening. "And make sure to clean the basin. I don't want any trace of that ash you reek of near me when I'm measured for my dress." The next few days blurred. The manor became a hive of frantic activity. Seamstresses arrived, their arms full of satin and lace. Jewelers came with boxes of earrings and circlets. Madame ordered new shoes crafted, delicate ones made of glassine leather so thin the outline of Alenia's toes would show beneath. Mira, as always, was tasked with everything. She held pins between her lips as the dress was fitted. She scrubbed the flagstones till her hands bled. She fetched crushed violet leaves for perfume and scrubbed the walls of the hearth where the ashes stained. Through it all, Alenia walked with practiced grace, never barefoot, always careful. Not once did Mira see that left foot uncovered. Not once did she forget. That night, as Mira lay in the dark, she peeled back the old wool sock covering her own foot. She held a stolen candle to the scar that curved faintly above her smallest toe. The skin was slightly discolored. Not fresh. Not raised like a wound. But still there. If what she remembered was true, if the mark had been there once, why would anyone have wanted to remove it? Why would anyone else want to steal it? The answer was obvious. A marriage to the crown prince. A prophecy. A throne. It wasn't just ambition. It was power. Legacy. All tied to a single mark. Mira turned the candle upside down and let a drop of wax fall onto the floor. She watched it harden. That's what they had done to her. Taken her birthright and sealed it away with lies and wax and silence. By the third day, carriages began arriving at the manor gates. Other noble families, eager to boast their daughters before the crown, came bearing gifts and offering congratulations to Madame. The manor, usually cloaked in muted tones and domestic rhythms, became a theater. Mira watched from the shadows. Every girl who arrived was examined, their feet checked privately by royal inspectors who whispered quietly, nodded solemnly, and passed judgment with a single shake of the head. Some of the girls wept when they were dismissed. Others left fuming, humiliated by the scrutiny. Leone had not yet been examined. Madame had insisted her daughter be saved for last, for maximum impact, she said. Mira worked late that evening, carrying linens and scrubbing chamber pots, and yet her thoughts stayed fixed on one image, Leone's foot. That single toe. That lie. She had to be sure. So she took a risk. That night, when the house was dark, Mira crept silently from the cellar and slipped into Leone's chamber. She knew where the slippers were kept, knew which drawers creaked and which floorboards to avoid. Her heart pounded as she eased open the wardrobe. There, beneath folds of pale silk, lay the special shoes, the glassine leather pair meant for the royal presentation. Mira picked one up gently, turning it in her hands. Inside, stuffed into the toe box, was a wad of cotton. She tugged it out and her breath caught. Inside the cotton was something waxy, solid, a sculpted fragment of something curved. Toe. Perfectly shaped. Pale. Cold. She felt bile rise in her throat. She put it back exactly where she found it, heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped bird. Leone didn't just hide her foot. She faked it. And if the prince's court examined her closely, if they suspected anything, it would not just be Leone's ambition at risk. It would be Myra's life too. Madame would never let her live if she were exposed. Not now. Not after this much effort. This much deception. Mira fled back to the cellar. She didn't sleep. In the morning the trumpets sounded. The royal escort had arrived. The manor shifted into a temple built for one purpose, to prepare Leone for glory. Each morning began earlier than the last. Myra's bones ached before the sun had fully risen. She was yanked from her mat on the cellar floor by the kitchen bell and scurried barefoot across cold stone to draw water, mix herbs, light coals, steep oils, and prepare the long list of concoctions Madame insisted were necessary to ready Leone's body for the royal gaze. Milk baths, rose-soaked cloths, crushed pearl paste. She'd never even seen a pearl before this week, and now she ground them like salt. Leone became worse with every passing hour. She screamed when the water was too hot, then too cold. She slapped when Mira brushed her hair too roughly, then berated her for taking too long. Once, Mira forgot the cinnamon oil Madame said must be applied to the soles of Leone's feet to stimulate circulation. Leone poured the entire bowl onto Myra's head. It dripped into her eyes and stung for hours. "You're lucky I'm allowing you to serve me," Leone hissed as Mira knelt, blotting up the mess. "If they ask about you at court, I'll just say you're the dumb one we keep around for pity." Madame didn't even glance at the mess on the rug. She was too busy inspecting Leone's ankles for swelling. Mira kept her head down, saying nothing. But inside, something had started to burn. Not just anger, it had passed anger days ago. This was something colder. Older. Like a part of her that had once been taken was waking up and demanding to be reclaimed. She began paying closer attention. Leone always flinched when her left foot was touched, even through stockings. Mira noticed she never walked barefoot on the stone floors, even when it was just the two of them. And more than once, she saw Leone glance toward the drawer where the slippers and the fake toe were hidden with something close to panic. There were moments, rare, flickering moments, when Mira caught Madame and Leone in deep, heated whispers. Their heads would tilt together. Eyes would dart toward the door. One night, Mira rose from her mat and crept up the servants' stairs, placing each foot with the precision of a dancer, careful to avoid the warped boards. She crouched near the hall that led to Madame's room and listened. Their voices bled through the walls. "Not entirely healed. The skin is still pale. She'll never know. We cut deep enough and the fire sealed it. She was only a baby. What if she remembers? Children don't remember pain. Not real pain. Not when they're that small. She looks at me strangely sometimes. She should be grateful. We saved her from a life she couldn't handle." There was a pause. Then Leone again, lower now. It was mine the moment it left her body. She wasn't meant for it. A creak in the wall made Mira slip away before they could hear her heartbeat pounding like thunder in the silence. She slept badly after that. Every dream was filled with bandages, firelight, and the echo of her own cries. A crib. A fever. Madame bending over her with something glowing hot in the tongs. She remembered now. Not clearly but like shadows on water. Flashes. Bang. Eat. A shape on her foot. Her father shouting, and then, nothing. No more father. No more Mark. Only Madame and Leone, both of them watching her as if she were a tool they hadn't decided how to sharpen yet. The next morning Mira stole a moment alone and took off her sock. She studied the faint line on her foot, curved and pale. A healed cut, aged by years. The crescent shape still visible beneath the scar tissue. The mark had been there. It was hers. Alenia didn't even walk like the marked girls were said to. The old tales whispered that the child of the silver moon would have a lightness to her, as though she carried stardust in her bones. Mira had always felt too light, too small, as though her body never fully touched the earth. Alenia by contrast stomped. The deception thickened with each passing hour. Madame bribed a seamstress to alter Alenia's shoes subtly, one heel slightly lower to mask the imbalance caused by the wax toe. She had a physician deliver a cream to dull nerve endings so Alenia wouldn't flinch under inspection. Mira was sent to dispose of the empty vial in the woods so no one would find the label. It was all lies. And Mira was carrying the weight of all of it on her back like a stone mantle. Still she said nothing. She bathed Alenia. She polished her nails with crushed hibiscus. She helped dress her in a gown dyed the color of moonlight. Alenia sat smugly in the vanity chair, running her fingers over her lips and practicing what she'd say when the prince asked her name. "I'll tilt my head just slightly," she murmured, studying herself in the mirror. "They say the chosen girl is meant to look ethereal, don't they? Do I look ethereal?" Mira didn't answer. "What would you say if he asked you?" Alenia mocked. "Oh wait. He'd never even look at a thing like you." Mira remained silent, but her gaze sharpened. That night, Mira crept back to the old nursery, a room long unused and locked from the main hall. She'd once spent every night in this room before the cellar became her place. The window still had bars, not because it needed them, but because Madame had said servants fall easily. Dust coated the cradle. The rocking chair sat quiet in the corner. Mira knelt and pried up the loose floorboard beneath the old toy box. The rag doll her father made was still there, its button eye missing, its yarn hair tangled. And next to it, wrapped in yellowed cloth, was a scrap of paper. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. A birth record. Name Mira Alishtara. Born under the 13th moon. Mark, present. Left foot. Crescent-shaped. Signed by her father's hand. She clutched the paper like a lifeline and pressed her forehead to her knees. They'd stolen everything. The next morning, Madame announced that the royal carriage would arrive within 2 days. Alenia would be presented on the final day of the selection. Saved for last, as Madame insisted, the best always closes the show. They threw a small feast that evening for the household, though Mira wasn't allowed to sit. She served sweetmeats and wine to guests while Alenia paraded like she already wore a crown. Mira moved between rooms like smoke, invisible, unnoticed, until Alenia cornered her in the hall. She was flushed from drink, her voice loud and triumphant. 2 days, Mira, she said. And then you can go back to scrubbing dishes for the rest of your life. I'll be a princess. And maybe I'll tell them to keep you around just so I can laugh. Mira met her eyes then, truly met them, for the first time in days. Alenia faltered slightly. "What?" she said a little quieter. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Mira didn't answer. But she let her gaze drop to Alenia's left foot, just long enough for the message to land. She knew. Alenia's face went pale. "You wouldn't dare." Mira stepped past her without another word. Back in the cellar, she lit the candle slowly and unwrapped the old record. She placed it next to her foot and traced the curve of the mark, the way her father once had. She felt something settle in her chest. Not peace but clarity. A final shape to a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. They had taken the mark from her. But they hadn't taken her name. And when the royal carriage came, she would ride in it, not because she was chosen, but because she'd always been the one foretold. It was early, long before the house stirred, when Mira crept from the cellar to begin the morning's preparations. The sky outside was still purple, dew thick on the garden stones, but inside the manor, everything was heavy with a breathless tension. Tomorrow the royal carriage would come. Tomorrow, Alenia would be escorted to the palace, draped in silver silk, presented as the chosen one. And Mira would fade into shadow unless she did something before then. The bath had already been drawn in the small chamber off Alenia's room, a copper tub steaming gently in the flickering light. Mira poured in the last of the rose oil and swirled it with her hand. The scent of crushed petals curled up with the vapor and clung to her skin. She wiped her hands on her apron, knees aching, and turned just in time to see Alenia enter. She was wrapped in a long robe, her hair pinned back in gold combs. She swept into the room with the air of someone arriving at her coronation rather than a bath. Mira helped her disrobe, averting her gaze as always, but her eyes flicked downward almost involuntarily, toward the left foot. Alenia caught the glance and sneered. Careful, she snapped. You look at it too long you might turn to stone. Mira said nothing. She poured water over Alenia's legs, steady and practiced, letting the silence hang. Alenia lounged back in the tub, closing her eyes as if already imagining herself on a throne. Her fingers floated lazily over the surface of the water. Mira worked slowly, her motions methodical. She began with Alenia's arms, then her shoulders, then legs. As she reached the feet, she hesitated, but only for a breath. Her hands, so often trembling under cruelty, were now as steady as stone. She lifted the left foot from the water. Alenia cracked one eye open. Well, she said sharply. Just scrubbing, Mira replied. She took the soft cloth and passed it gently over the foot. The smallest toe as always looked odd, too round, too smooth, like it had never curled or flexed. Mira had seen it before, had even touched it in passing, but now she was looking not as a servant, but as a spy. The cloth passed over the toe again and something changed. It glistened slightly more than the skin around it. The water clung to it strangely. And as Mira dabbed the edge of the nail, a faint smear, barely noticeable, appeared on the cloth. She paused. The toe gleamed faintly. It wasn't real. Her heart thudded. She pressed again, more firmly this time, dragging the cloth across the toe in a slow, deliberate stroke. A sliver of wax came away, thin and pale as a shaving from a candle. She stared at it, transfixed. The toe was wax. The whole thing. Sculpted and colored, yes, but imperfect. Melting slightly in the heat of the bath. It had softened just enough to give itself away. Alenia's eyes snapped open. She looked down and froze. Mira met her gaze. For the first time, Alenia looked afraid. You, she began. Mira folded the cloth, hiding the wax smear, and continued washing as if nothing had happened. No need to get out yet, she said softly. The water's still warm. Alenia hesitated, then leaned back again, but her posture was tight, watchful. Later, Mira emptied the basin and carefully disposed of the cloth in the hearth, watching the wax melt and vanish into the flames. But the truth could not burn away. It only hardened. The toe was false. And it was hiding more than just a wound. It was hiding the absence of the mark. Alenia had never been chosen. She had only stolen the story. And the wax was her disguise. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Seamstresses made final alterations. The manor bustled with footmen polishing brass, the steward coordinating the palace protocol. Mira moved through it all like smoke, silent and unnoticed. She packed Alenia's gowns, laid out the crystal slippers, even prepared the royal envelope with her forged lineage documents. Madame had spared no expense. No detail had been left to chance, except perhaps the one toe that couldn't hold its shape under heat. The palace gates towered above them, carved with sigils that shimmered faintly in the morning sun. A crowd had gathered already, stretching across the marble steps and into the grand plaza below, women in brocade and lace and velvet waiting restlessly in a line that snaked like a river of color. Their voices buzzed with anticipation, nervous laughter, and occasional sharp glares at anyone who dared cut ahead. But Alenia would not be waiting in line. Madame stepped from the carriage dressed in layered satin, her rings glittering with stones as bright as her painted smile. She didn't glance at Mira, who climbed down after her, arms full of slippers, washcloths and scented oils. Myra's shoulders already ached from the weight. The travel trunks had been stuffed full of appearances and lies, and she was now expected to carry all of them. A guard in a black-stitched uniform stood at the edge of the courtyard, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Madame swept up to him with the elegance of someone who knew money would be enough. She drew a velvet pouch from her sleeve and pressed it into his hand, her voice low, confident. "She has an urgent letter of appointment," Madame said smoothly, gesturing toward Alenia, who lifted her chin with a practiced look of faint boredom. The guard raised an eyebrow but opened the pouch slightly. His fingers disappeared inside and returned with coin. He waited, then nodded. "This way," he said and pulled open the side gate. Mira followed them through the servants' door into a hallway scented with citrus and fresh linen. The palace interior was unlike anything she'd ever imagined. The floor was polished to such a shine she could see the distorted reflection of her face in it. The ceilings arched like cathedral wings, painted with stars and moons in gold leaf. Light spilled in from high windows, catching the silk of noble dresses and bouncing off the silver plates carried by attendants. As they walked, Mira caught glimpses of other girls, dozens, maybe hundreds, ushered into holding rooms with velvet benches and embroidered cushions. All of them were nobles, some with entire entourages. Servants, governesses, chaperones. They came from every corner of the kingdom, their eyes fixed on the doors beyond which the prince waited. In one room, Mira saw a woman soaking her feet in scented water while another fluffed her hair. In another, two sisters argued loudly over who had the more symmetrical toes. Footmen moved briskly, carrying trays of fruit and scrolls. The air was rich with perfume and ambition. Mira's role was clear. She was to stay behind, stand in the corner, hold what was handed to her, and keep her mouth shut. They were led to a chamber lined with tall glass mirrors and gilded sconces. Alenia was given a private stool, raised on a dais near a curtained archway that led to the inner chamber where the prince and the court physician waited. "Prepare her," Madame said to Mira curtly. Mira set down the slippers and cloths, her fingers nimble as she unbuckled Alenia's shoes. Her hands brushed the familiar left foot. The wax toe was in place again, hardened now in the cooler air, but Mira could still see the faint hairline smudge at the joint. She said nothing. She washed Alenia's feet, dried them with care, and slid the jeweled slippers on. Alenia stared at her throughout, hawk-eyed and tight-lipped. "If you breathe even strangely," she murmured under her breath, "I will see to it that you disappear." Mira kept her expression blank, folding the towel and retreating to the wall. Time passed slowly. Mira watched as noble women entered the examination chamber one by one. The court physician, a tall, lean man with square spectacles, sat beside a velvet stool, where each girl would lift her skirt and bare her feet. The seer stood near him, eyes half-lidded, her hands glowing faintly with magic. The prince was seated further back, silent and unmoving, his face unreadable. The first girl entered and emerged moments later, red-faced and near tears. No mark. Then another. Then another. Each time, Mira saw the hopeful gleam in their eyes, dashed upon the cold wall of rejection. No one argued. No one dared. The silver moon mark was rare, perhaps even singular. The seer could not be fooled, and neither could the prince. Still they came. A girl in green velvet claimed her mark had faded in childhood. Another presented an old birth scroll signed by a midwife. One had painted a mark onto her ankle with ash, but the seer wiped it away with a single stroke and sent her out in disgrace. Mira stood as still as she could, her arms aching again. Her feet hurt. Her stomach growled. But she said nothing. Alenia, however, grew more and more fidgety. "She's taking too long," she whispered to her mother. "What if the prince grows tired before I'm seen?" "He won't," Madame said firmly. "And if he does, we will find another entrance. You are the chosen one." Alenia's mouth twitched. Mira couldn't help noticing it then, how thin the veil of Alenia's confidence truly was. Beneath the arrogance and poise she was afraid. She knew the wax would not hold forever. And yet, she kept pressing forward, convinced the palace would believe what her mother had always believed, that beauty, performance and money could cover the truth. It was nearly midday now. The palace bells rang softly in the distance, announcing the hour. Suddenly, a noble woman with hair like braided ink stormed out of the examination chamber in tears. "It's a scar, not a mark," she cried. "And even then it wasn't my fault." She was silenced by a courtier, who escorted her away without ceremony. Madame rose. "We're next." Alenia stood in the chamber's center like a statue carved of precious stone, her beauty honed to a fine edge, every gesture precise, every breath measured. Her hair had been curled and pinned with pearls, her cheeks dusted with rouge, her dress the color of crushed rose petals. Even the way she stepped forward was rehearsed, measured, floating, demure. The courtiers looked on in quiet awe. Even the prince leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. The chamber had quieted as she entered. The air was tense, reverent. Only the slow chime of water dripping from a nearby fountain broke the silence. The scent of jasmine curled faintly in the warmth. Mira stood at the edge of the room, not quite hidden behind the pillar. Her hands were folded, but her knuckles were white. The moment had come. And it was already unraveling. Alenia had removed her slippers at the physician's request and now stood barefoot on the velvet platform. The moment she did, Mira saw the wax begin to give way. The chamber was warm, deliberately so. The tall windows let in beams of golden light that heated the tiles, and braziers smoldered softly in each corner. The royal court believed in testing the girls with comfort and pressure. Nothing reveals falsehood more quickly than heat and silence. Alenia's feet, delicate and pale, were trembling slightly. She shifted her weight from one to the other. Mira could see it from where she stood, the faint sheen beginning to form at the edge of the smallest toe. It glistened, catching the light like a pearl of sweat. The court physician stepped forward, kneeling as he had for every girl before. He did not rush. He took a small silver basin from the assistant and poured a measure of warm water over her feet, letting it trickle down gently to clean any dust or debris. It was ceremonial, almost sacred. The water touched the wax toe. Mira inhaled. The wax, already softened, began to warp, just slightly. A faint line appeared where the toe met the foot. Too clean a line. Too smooth. The court physician furrowed his brow. From across the chamber, one of the younger attendants, barely more than a boy, tilted his head, squinting. He took a step closer, lips parted. The physician reached out and gently pressed the small toe. It dipped inward, not like skin, not like bone, but like pliable candle wax under pressure. A drop fell. It was tiny. Silent. Barely noticed by most. But Mira saw it. It struck the polished marble floor with the softest of taps, leaving behind a faint oily smear. The attendant gasped. He stepped forward and pointed. Her toe, it's melting. Whispers ignited like brush fire. The chamber filled with the sound of silk rustling, of shoes shifting on stone. Several courtiers leaned closer. One lady covered her mouth. Another muttered, "Impossible." Alenia tried to remain still, her face blank. But her eyes flicked toward the drop. She must have felt it, felt the cooling stream trail down her foot. The court physician stood sharply. This, he looked to the prince. This is not natural. Alenia's voice broke. She reached for a stool to steady herself, then knelt quickly, trying to press her foot against the warm velvet to hide it. But another drop fell. This time the sound was louder in the silence. And the prince stood. Mira took a breath. She hadn't meant to speak. But the words came unbidden, unrelenting, the truth long pressed into silence finally cracking the shell it had been trapped in. She's not the one, Mira said, her voice trembling. That toe, it's made of wax. It always was. Everyone turned. Even the prince. The court physician narrowed his eyes. Explain yourself. Mira stepped forward, each movement slow, deliberate, as if walking through water. Her legs trembled, but she did not stop. She lost the toe, or injured it years ago. I don't know how or when. But I know it isn't real. I've washed her feet every day since I could hold a cloth. Alenia's face had gone pale. She's lying. She's just a servant. She's jealous. She never lets anyone look too closely, Mira said, ignoring the rising heat of fear in her chest. She slaps me if I do. But I noticed. I remembered. And when the wax began to melt in warm water, I saw what was underneath. The seer stepped forward now. Her robe shimmered faintly with hidden sigils, her long hands gliding through the air as she moved. Her eyes never blinked. There is no mark beneath, she said. No glow. No echo of the silver moon. That's because it faded, Alenia hissed, now desperate. When I was a baby, my mother said it was there. The physician crouched again and reached for a small scalpel. He scraped gently along the smallest toe. Wax curled away like peeling skin. Beneath it, nothing. A gnarled stub healed long ago. Smooth pink skin, unmarked. Ordinary. A loud gasp swept the chamber. The prince's face was unreadable, but his hands were clenched at his sides. The seer shook her head slowly. She is not the one. But Alenia's breath caught. My mother said she promised. She lied to you, Mira said quietly. It was only then that Alenia looked at her. And Mira saw something break in her stepsister's face. Not anger, not even hatred, but the hollow crack of a life built on illusion caving in. Madame burst into the chamber a moment later, skirts flying. My daughter, there's been a mistake. The prince held up his hand. No more deception. Guards appeared from the sides, silent and sudden. They did not touch Alenia, but they flanked her, firm and unmoving. Mira stood with her hands at her sides, trembling. The seer turned to the prince and said, There is another. The court hushed again. Hope sparked like lightning in a storm cloud. Another? The prince asked. The seer nodded. She is here. She was never meant to be seen as a candidate, but her thread has wound through this fate from the beginning. The seer turned slowly, and her eyes fixed on Mira. Heat rushed to Myra's face. Me? She whispered. The court murmured again. The physician looked startled. But she's just a servant. She was never meant to be, the seer said. The mark is not something that can be hidden. Not truly. The silver moon does not choose based on bloodlines or rank. It chooses based on heart. Mira wanted to back away. She had always been told to be silent, to be invisible, to obey. But now the seer was extending her hand. Mira stood still as the quiet wrapped around her, heavy as velvet. The air in the grand chamber was thick with breath held and hearts caught mid-beat. She could feel the heat of their eyes, all of them, nobles, attendants, guards, the prince himself. Her slipper felt like it weighed 100 stones, the battered thing laced in mud and threadbare leather. Her foot trembled. The prince did not speak again, only extended his hand in a silent request. There was no command in it, only calm curiosity. And something deeper, something that felt like respect. Mira took a breath and knelt slowly, her knees pressing into the velvet-covered dais where noble women had stood all morning. Her hands, calloused and raw from years of scrubbing floors and fetching water, moved to the edge of her slipper. She hesitated. She remembered flashes, being small and wrapped in blankets, the smell of burnt herbs, the prickle of firelight. A woman with trembling hands and ash smeared across her cheeks. A blade. A scream. Then years of silence. The memories had been shadows before, shapes in a fog. Now they pressed against her ribs like truth ready to burst free. Her fingers pulled gently. The slipper came away. At first, her foot looked like any other, pale, rough in patches, a heel worn hard by long days on stone floors. But just beneath the curve of her ankle, in the softest flesh between bone and soul, a shimmer stirred. It pulsed faintly under the skin, like moonlight caught in water. Gasps fluttered through the room. It wasn't bold or glowing like a torch. It was faded, scarred, delicate, a symbol half lost to time. But it was there. A silver crescent, barely larger than a thumbprint. It pulsed once more as if waking. The court physician stepped forward, eyes wide. It's healed over. Long ago. Scar tissue hid the glow. The seer nodded. And yet it remains. No illusion. No wax. No trick. Mira looked up through her lashes and saw the prince gazing at her, not with hunger or entitlement, but with the stillness of a man who had waited a long time to understand something. He stepped down from his platform slowly. The silks of his coat whispered with each movement, and when he reached her, he did not speak. He dropped to one knee. A collective breath drew in around the chamber. Myra's mouth parted in shock. He was not proposing. This was no fairy tale gesture. There was no swoon, no promise of love. He knelt not in pursuit of romance, but in recognition. Recognition of the truth that had survived fire. Recognition of a girl who had been told she was less. Recognition of a power that chose her, not because of a title, but because of something older and deeper than blood. The prince bowed his head. "Welcome home," he said softly. "We lost you. But you were never gone." Mira felt the sting behind her eyes and looked away quickly. She wasn't used to being seen, truly seen. Her place had always been in the corners, behind the curtain, behind Alenia, behind orders and bruises and silence. But now here she was, barefoot, bruised, and chosen. From the far side of the room, Alenia gave a small sound, a strangled sob or a gasp. Mira didn't look. She couldn't. If she did, she feared she might lose this fragile thread of clarity holding her steady. She could face her later. For now this moment was hers. The seer stepped closer and opened a small vial from her robes. She poured a glimmering liquid, like melted silver, into her palm and anointed Myra's foot. The mark shimmered brighter in its presence, and the crescent lit for a moment like it remembered its own name. "It recognizes her," the seer murmured. "As do we." The prince rose. The girl who was hidden. The girl who was burned. The girl who bore the pain in silence. She carries what no royal training can mimic. No one objected. Not a single voice of dissent rose in the hall. Even the king, aged and sharp-eyed, stood and nodded once from his throne. The chamber had already judged. And the truth was more radiant than gold. One of the chambermaids, someone Mira had scrubbed floors beside, began to cry softly. The noble women who had posed so carefully earlier now stepped back. Not in fear but in awe. One even dipped her head. The recognition rippled outward. Mira saw it, felt it, and knew that something in her life, something that had been broken at birth, was knitting itself whole again. She looked down at her foot, now faintly aglow, the scar still visible through the mark. She had not been erased. She had been tempered. And now the world saw her, not as a servant girl, not as a shadow of her stepsister, but as the one chosen long ago, whose truth had been buried but not destroyed. She did not need a crown. She had her name.